So without further ado, I just want to say a couple of words about Bob here before I welcome him to the stage. So Bob Fischer is a professor of philosophy at Texas State University and a senior research manager at Rethink Priorities. He helps run the Animal Welfare Economics Working Group, the Arthropoda Foundation, and the Insect Welfare Research Society. So everyone please give me a hand in welcoming Bob Fischer to the stage. Yes.
Okay, my friends, we've got a lot of material to cover, a lot of uncertainty to navigate. So let us dive in. So what we're going to talk about today is the practice of setting up a giving portfolio, thinking about how you're going to split the pot. You decided, you made the excellent choice, you're going to give away 10% of your resources. How are you going to divvy up those resources? Are you going to go all in on insects? Of course, that would be lovely. I'm invested in that cause, but probably not. You're going to spread. You're going to give some to give well. You're going to give some maybe to your favorite X risk related group. You're going to give some to animals, whatever. And what percentages? How are you going to make these decisions? Okay? And so you might think about the talk here as how, though, are we going to do this when we're not really sure what to do? Right? Because part of the premise of this talk, the thing that is driving me in giving this is that we might be really uncertain about what exactly to value. It's not that we don't care about doing the most good, right? We're here, we're invested in this kind of project, we care about the activity of trying to maximize. However, we're not totally sure what we should be maximizing. Is it really that we just stare at the hedonic consequences, how much suffering happens to be out there? Should we be focusing on various kinds of preferences that people have? Should we be thinking about the long-term future, and if so, to what degree, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There are all sorts of things that we might care about a lot, and we might not be sure how much to care about any one of them. And when we find ourselves in that situation, when we look at all of these things we might be uncertain over, we can feel a sense of vertigo, right? And so what my team at Rethink Priorities has done over the course of the last several months is we tried to force ourselves to put some numbers on our uncertainties and see what happens when you build a tool that is designed to navigate some of this, to make us be explicit and as concrete as possible about our uncertainties, and then see what falls out of that. The way we think about it is something like, let's give some structure to our ignorance. We're not going to solve the fundamental problems of moral philosophy in 4 months, I am sorry to say. Not that we haven't tried. However, they are really difficult, thorny problems. And so often the best thing that you can do is take yourself from being in a situation where, well, there are a zillion uncertainties and we have no idea how they're related to one another, to a situation where you can say, okay, I can see at least a bit of the landscape now. I can see the peaks and valleys. I can see how we get an overall sense of the implications of changing one thing versus another, rebalancing the portfolio in this way rather than that, okay? And so what we have is to set this up is to first distinguish the kinds of things about which we might be uncertain. So the most common thing, the thing about which we're most familiar are ordinary empirical uncertainties, right? We just don't quite know what the consequences of given action are going to be. We have to sort that out. We also can have decision theoretic uncertainty. We can say, well, hey, look, I've got all of my uncertainties. I know that there are various things I'm not sure about in the world, but I'm not quite sure how I should navigate that. To what degree should I be risk averse, for instance? To what degree should I be trying to avoid worst case outcomes? Or to what degree should I be concerned that my actions make a difference versus just doing the risk neutral, maximize expected value sort of thing, right? You can be normatively uncertain. Right? You can be uncertain about, well, how much should I value human lives versus animal lives, or a human quality versus an animal quality? How much should I care about the welfare of people in the far future, et cetera, right? And I can have meta-normative uncertainty. I can look at my normative uncertainty and be like, I don't really know how to navigate that, right? I can look at all my normative uncertainty and say, well, I mean, should I be trying to just do the thing that sort of seems best according to all the theories? Should I be treating them like voters in a moral parliament? Should I be letting them bargain about what they care about most? How exactly do I proceed? And then, we can get the same kind of meta level thing about decision theory, where we can be like, I want to be risk neutral, but maybe I also want to be risk averse. And I'm like, 20% on one of these and 80% on the other. And how do I navigate that? So all of it just, it cascades, right? But once we distinguish it, we can again start to build some things. And what we've got here are these two tools that we've been putting out. And I'm going to focus on one of them. So over the last several months, we built this portfolio builder. Portfolio builder is designed to think about some of these uncertainties in particular. And what it does is it says, okay, if you are trying to make decisions at that very highest level between cause areas, how would you do that given various kinds of uncertainties that you might be concerned about? But the moral parliament tool is really focused on this problem of being uncertain about what we value. Now, if you have that kind of uncertainty, which I myself feel very acutely as a moral philosopher, where I spend all of my time thinking about arguments for and against different moral positions, moral theories, and often think, man, this is really hard to sort out. There are really great arguments for very different views. And every time I think that I've sort of found my way in this landscape, I see yet another fascinating consideration for a thing that I hadn't yet considered. And in that situation, I really want to sort out moral uncertainty in particular. So we're going to focus on that particular dimension. And so what we got is this moral parliament tool. And that's what I'm going to talk you through, and then more importantly, think a little bit about the implications of doing this kind of work and what that might mean for thinking about giving. So what we did is take a metaphor that has been around in EA for a while. So lots of people have talked about the idea of a moral parliament as a strategy for thinking about uncertainty. And the idea here is the simplest, crudest version. Let's think about your credence as a 100-member parliament, right? A 100-member parliament. A point of your credence per parliamentary member. And then let's think about the things over which you are uncertain as representing members of the parliament in different numbers depending on your credences in them. So if part of you is inclined toward a simple, act utilitarian sort of view, do the thing that maximizes net welfare, then, and you're like, I put 60% of my credence on that. We can think of that as 60 members of the parliament are act utilitarians. And then if you put a big chunk of your credence on some kind of rights view, like, well, I think that people have rights, and ultimately what we ought to do is respect those rights and somehow build the kind of world that is best suited to protecting those fundamental side constraints on engaging with others, then say 40 members of that parliament would go toward that view. That's sort of the simplest cartoon version of the picture. And people have talked about this perspective, this metaphor rather, that you might have for thinking about uncertainty. And what it's useful for doing is then giving you procedures that you might follow for navigating your uncertainty. So you say, well, I'm uncertain what to think about this big, really fundamental question. Part of me is kind of into this utilitarian view. Part of me is into this rights view. How should I proceed? And what the parliament metaphor does is help you think, okay, well, what would happen if I just let them do a simple voting procedure, majority rules? What's going to happen? Utilitarian always wins, right? But of course, we also have other voting procedures. We have different ways that people can make collective decisions, right? We don't always just do a simple majority vote. In lots of cases, we let groups bargain. We let groups find various ways of resolving their disagreements. And once we start thinking in that interpersonal way, we can think about that within an individual as well and say, well, how might you, as a single person, start balancing the competing considerations in your head? That's the appeal of thinking about a moral parliament. Okay, that's the value of it. So, big picture, we've now gone through quite a lot of stuff already. So big picture, where are we? We've got this problem or at least I experience as a problem. Maybe you have perfect moral clarity, wonderful if so, but if not, right, you've got some values, you're not sure how to balance them, you're not sure which things you care about most, you're not sure which things it's most important to do. And then what we do is we take that and we say, well, what if we treat your credence as a bit like a parliament? We represent that then as individuals representing the views over which you are uncertain, and then we can start thinking about the procedures they might use to resolve their disagreements. That's the overall chain of reasoning that gets us to this tool. And the thought is, if we do that, maybe that will help us with the thing that we talked about at the very beginning, where we're trying to structure our ignorance. Hey, we're not going to resolve these disagreements. We're not going to resolve all our uncertainties, but maybe we can get a clearer view of the topography of the moral landscape by this exercise. Okay? So, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to walk you through some of the features of this tool, and then we'll talk about some of the implications of taking it seriously. Okay. First, we're going to have some projects. These are the kinds of things that you're used to thinking about, right? The Against Malaria Foundation, Shrimp Welfare Project, the Humane League, right? The Center for Long-Term Risk, et cetera, et cetera. These are groups that are out there trying to do various things in the world in an attempt to improve it, right? And then you're going to have a bunch of worldviews. These are going to be moral outlooks, overall attitudes toward what's valuable and how valuable it is, as well as how you think about risk. And then what we're going to do is we're going to form our parliament. And our parliament is going to be that mechanism that we use to represent our uncertainty. So those are the major components. And we, of course, didn't want to talk about actual charities, so we just made up charities. The Tuberculosis Initiative. This may bear some commonalities to things that are actually out there in the world. Any commonalities, of course, are accidental, and I would never directly compare the things that we made up to the things that are out there in the world. But, you know, we did that in part just to give us a little bit of distance because, of course, we don't want to be claiming that, you know, this is exactly the profile of something that's actually being done, but it's forcing us to get clearer and put numbers on things. So what we did was we built this list of projects, and we then went through and had to think about, well, okay, if you take this project seriously, who matters according to that project, right? Who is it trying to target? How is it assessing the value of its impact? And so we have to assign some values to stuff. So if you're thinking about tuberculosis, you're probably thinking about tuberculosis in humans. You're not out there worrying about tuberculosis in cattle. And so you're just assigning value to humans. So if you look down there in the beneficiary section and just see a 1 by humans, what that basically means is, yeah, that's the thing that this charity is trying to value, right? And then what it's going to do is it's going to, and we'll just run through this very quickly, it's going to assign a status to beings listing at different times. How important are you based on when you exist, right? It's going to say, how much do you care about creating good things in the world versus preventing bad things in the world, right? If you think, I mean, you know, think about AMF, right? If you're against Malaria Foundation, you're not trying to, you know, build the optimal society. You're just trying to like stop kids from dying, right? You're focused on averting bads. Of course, averting bads has good consequences, right? We're not saying it doesn't. But your goal is not like bring about the greatest possible world, right? Your goal is prevent really awful things that are preventable from occurring versus someone who is, you know, think about kind of like one version of the long-termist story that we've perhaps all heard about, where the goal is to bring about the ideal outcome where there's, you know, endless numbers of digital minds just like swimming in happiness, digital happiness, whatever exactly that consists in. That's an attempt to bring about a very positive possible world. Who knows what we should think about that? But that's, it's a contrast with just preventing bads. Okay? You're going to care about different things, right? Are you really focused just on the sort of simple hedonic considerations? Are you focused on something like flourishing, where you want people to have their rights respected, and you want to have a certain kind of moral culture that you're trying to bring about, where people can achieve the various goods that are associated with a human life? Are you thinking about justice and equity, all different sorts of considerations? You're going to have risk attitudes. How worried are you about backfiring, right? How worried are you about things going badly in your particular situation if you try this intervention? And then finally, you're going to have a thing about scale. Scale is just, which there's no separate side for scale because, I'm a third-rate presenter and forgot to include a scale slide. But the scale is just like the magnitude of the impact if you're successful. And let me just pause here to flag something that's very important. The interest of this exercise thus far is just that the challenge of slapping some numbers on these things, right? Simply having to point out that there are all these values and you have to choose particular ones is itself interesting and complicated. One of the things that has been very striking to me in completing this project is finding out just how sensitive your results are to small changes here. So one of the things that I think is important for us to recognize, this is lesson 1, right? Tuck this one away, is just that when you don't have to put numbers on these specific values, it's very easy to think, well, it probably comes out in the wash, doesn't really matter, and it's going to end up being the case that, the small possibility of a large and positive future means that X-risk-related work always dominates, or something like that. But actually, these numbers really matter, and making tiny tweaks makes a huge difference. And so it's not obviously the case that you get those kinds of results or any others, right? It's not obvious, in fact, that, small animals end up dominating all of your calculations, right? It's not obvious that the long-term future ends up dominating all of your calculations. In fact, small changes in your attitude toward risk, small changes in how much weight you place on different kinds of value give you quite different results. So that is one important thing. I think it's a reminder that our uncertainty should make us more cautious about bold claims about how things are going to play out when we run all of the numbers. In any case, that issue aside, remember, we started with our list of projects, then we go to worldviews, then we build the parliament. So we talked about the projects, now we're talking about the worldviews, and essentially we've got the same thing here. I'm not going to run through it to give you all of the possible results, but what you're seeing there on the left-hand side is a list of the worldviews that we included, right? And maybe you don't know what some of these terms mean. Don't worry about it. It's not going to matter for the purposes of this presentation. What they represent are variations in the space of moral possibilities, some that are really focused, the sort of the classic total utilitarian view, focused on the consequences independently of when they occur, and they're focused on a particular kind of consequence, namely the hedonic consequences, the pleasure and pain consequences that fall out of your actions or that follow from your actions, versus other kinds of views that you might have. You might really be into consequentialism. You care about what happens downstream from your actions, but you're risk averse. You want certain kinds of outcomes to get weighted a bit more than others because you don't want certain bad outcomes to be realized. You might care in a very different kind of way about outcomes. You might say, well, look, what I really want is a world where, I am respecting the legitimate claims of others. And if you have that kind of intuition, then you might be thinking about something more like a contractarian view, which we don't have to talk about in great detail, or a Kantian view, which again, we're not going to talk about it in great detail, but they are views that capture that thought, that respect and rights and those kinds of considerations are very important for thinking about what we ultimately ought to achieve, even in the context of our philanthropic efforts. And what we have then is a simple system where we have those list of projects, the worldviews are evaluated by the projects, and then we are going to have our credences in the worldviews. So you can see down there in the evaluations chunk of this, a list of some of the projects and how they are rated by this particular worldview. So total utilitarianism under the settings that happened to be in play when I was taking this screenshot really likes Lawyers for Chickens, which is a fictional charity that tries to pursue legal reforms for our avian friends, right? And the reason it likes it is because on that particular view, what's being valued are hedonic considerations, right? Pleasure and pain, chickens suffer a lot. And it cares about the numbers, right? A lot of chickens. And then given various other settings, you don't have other things dominating, right? So it's just an idiosyncratic feature of that particular view that you get that ranking, but that's the way it goes. Now, then we build our parliament, right? We have a bunch of credences across all of these views. And again, we're just thinking about this in your own mind. Think about that feeling of being like, yeah, I kind of feel the pull of that. Yeah, I kind of feel the pull of that. Yeah, I kind of feel the pull of that. And if you keep saying that as you encounter a lot of interesting philosophical proposals, then you can sort of feel how you might end up with a whole bunch of things on your list with, say, relatively low credences across the board. Or you might be someone, I've spoken to many EAs, who are like, I'm 99.999% in on total consequentialism, and I reserve some tiny percentage for, I don't know, some other variant of consequentialism, whatever. I mean, if that's your orientation, fine. Like, you can still play with the tool and get some results. It's not designed for you because you don't really have the kind of moral uncertainty that makes this interesting. But you can sort of see what this is attempting to get at. Okay, so the last piece, this is where all the action is, or this is where not all the action is, because remember, we already had one lesson. But it's where an important bit of the action is, because this is where we start thinking about how is it that we're going to navigate our uncertainty. So let me just run you through a couple of these things super quickly, just you get a flavor. So you could have this view called my favorite theory. My favorite theory says, suppose you've got like 10% credence in total utilitarianism. You think, I should do the thing that produces the greatest net good in terms of hedonic considerations, right? Over all time, right? But I got a low credence, only 10%. If that's the highest credence you got, though, if everything else you think is less likely than that, then my favorite theory says, well, just do that thing. Do whatever that theory says, right? Just choose the one that you have the highest credence in, and that's your recommended option. So that's one way you could go. And actually, I think a lot of people do this. They're like, yeah, ethics is hard, but I kind of lean toward this, so that's what I'm going to do, right? Are they super confident? No. But they do the thing that they think is, the best option or the best theory of the ones available to them. Or you could have something like maxi-min. Maxi-min says, just do whatever results in the worst case outcome being as good as possible. So look at what all the theories that you take seriously say, and make sure that the thing that you select, the action that you select, is the one that, by the lights of those theories, is least bad as it could be, right? That's the way. It's a kind of risk aversion. It's a way of saying, like, just don't do the awful thing, okay? Thank you. Just don't do the awful thing. Or you could have this kind of maximizing expected choice worthiness approach. That view says something like this. Well, what if we just kind of were still utilitarians, but about moral uncertainty, basically? What if we were just trying to do the thing that had the highest EV, but where we were calculating expected value in terms of the choice worthiness of our options. If you do something like that, you're going to have, again, a totally different way of sorting out the way that you handle your uncertainty. And so then you'll get a bunch of allocations. They'll say, here's how you split the money, right? And it'll give you percentages across the board. So let's now try to think about the implications of this in the remaining moments that we've got. We built this tool. What happens? Well, one way we could start thinking about it is to ask ourselves, well, what happens if we take the credences of the EA community, as demonstrated by survey results, and try to see what the EA community should do? So here's what happens if you build an EA parliament. So this represents, on the left-hand side, we can see what happens. We get the distribution of views in the EA community. And if you think, well, what I should do is look at my moral theories, and I should say, well, how much does each one care about this, right? How important is this action relative to each moral theory? And then I'm going to choose the thing that sort of gives the highest sort of credence-weighted results. That's sort of what's going on in maximizing expected choice worthiness. Then guess what? You should spend a lot of money on AI. So you get these very popular combinations of views just spit out this sort of result. But here's the interesting thing. As soon as you change that method for coming up with your allocation, you get different results. So suppose instead you thought that the way we should do this is by choosing something like ranked choice voting. Basics of ranked choice voting is that what we do is we each assign rankings to our favorite options. And then what we're going to do is look at that. So everybody votes for their favorite things in a list, right? We all assign numbers, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. If nobody gets the majority of the first place votes, then what we do is we take the thing that got the least first place votes, eliminate that one from the pot, redistribute those votes, and see who's at the top now. And we just keep doing that until somebody ends up as having the majority of first place votes. And it's a way of trying to achieve more consensus, options that are favored by a wider chunk of the group. That's the strategy behind ranked choice voting. It looks for consensus options. And then what happens? Well, animals look really good. And in fact, shrimp in particular look awesome on this strategy, right? Interestingly, if you do a different kind of voting, approval voting, which has a similar sort of style, but is less sensitive to the kinds of relative rankings that you assign to things, you still end up going very heavily in on animals and spending a lot on other things, right? But strikingly, you get quite different priorities. What's going on? What's going on? Here, I think, is the significance of this. There is a kind of naive approach to handling moral uncertainty where you just go with this, well, let's do the thing that seems like it has high STV, and that's like the simplest way of proceeding. But in fact, here we are in a situation where groups have to make decisions, organizations have to make decisions, and the kinds of decisions that they make are influenced by the procedures that they use to navigate their own disagreement. Open fill would get different results in the way it allocated resources if it used one voting procedure versus another. And if they were interested in trying to find the options that were sort of the best consensus compromise options in the community, they would have a different overall allocation. That doesn't mean that I'm not saying open fill is doing something that's tragically wrong. I'm pointing out that when large organizations make decisions, they are implicitly making assumptions about how best to navigate uncertainty, and we should notice that. It's an open question whether those are the right ways of making choices under uncertainty, and you will get different results. So we should care about it. So that was lesson 2, right? Lesson 1 was, hey, let's pay attention to the fact that when you slap numbers on things, the specific numbers matter. Lesson 2 was, oh my goodness, those methods that we have for navigating moral uncertainty really matter. Here is the third thing. This is purely self-serving as an experiment, because what I'm showing you is how I think about things. Not telling you that you should think about things this way yet, but I am telling you how I think about things, right? So I have spent, what is this, year 15 as a professor, and I've been thinking about ethics a lot, been teaching about it for a long time, and I still find myself not just uncertain, but often getting more uncertain about what to think about big theoretical issues. Where I think, some of this stuff, these are just really intractable debates. Every time I think I've gotten a toehold and can really see, yeah, this is how you would settle this debate, I think, maybe I've lost it, And the longer I do that, the more inclined I am to kind of spread my credences kind of broadly across moral theories. And to say, yeah, they're all capturing something really important. There is something insightful, significant about these different moral outlooks, but I'm really unsure how to choose between them. And so what I want to do then is think, what should I do in the context of my uncertainty? So one thing you can do is ask, well, what happens if you're in my situation? If you're like, yeah, ethics is really hard, and I don't really know how to choose among the various moral theories that are available to me. So what I did was set up the parliament that way, as you saw before, right, on that earlier slide, low credences across the board, and then look to see how things change when you just vary the method for navigating your uncertainty. And I also looked at the sensitivity, like what happens if I just bump the credences up and down? Does it change anything? Right, just at small amounts. The way I would expect a philosophical argument to change your mind. You hear an argument, and yeah, you should think like, oh, man, that's an interesting argument. Maybe I should be a little bit more inclined to believe the view that that's sports, but not super inclined, right? Don't jump from 5% in something to 95%. That's crazy, right? You make small shifts in small updates in your credences. But here's the interesting thing. What we find is actually most of these ways of navigating our uncertainty end up having global health look really good. Right? And you have to go in for this kind of idiosyncratic option to have it work out that you should go all in on the long-term future. Now, I will just be very clear. This is not exactly my preferred outcome. I'm an animal guy. I would like the results to say that you should go primarily in on animals. That would have been ideal from my perspective. Sadly, it didn't go that way. However, it went a way that I do think is very interesting, right? It suggested that once we start thinking about ways of navigating our uncertainty, and we are inclusive and broad in the way that we do that, we see a pull toward what was in fact the core motivation for EA at the outset. The thought that, hey, there is something you can do to prevent significant suffering. And so we ought to do it, right? If you are one of those people who were drawn to EA because you heard that fanciful story about the child drowning in the pond, right? As I was, then this is a kind of interesting result. So result 3 or lesson 3 is, if you're really uncertain, then it's worth thinking about what follows from the range of ways of navigating your uncertainty. And I think it's actually going to support, much to my own surprise and to some degree my own chagrin, primarily working on these global health projects, not because I think those are bad projects, I think they're great projects. I'm just reporting the way, I see things panning out. Okay, so we have a task here The task is, let's try to think about how best to construct a portfolio, how to split the resources, given that we're uncertain. What should we do? Well, what we've tried to do at Rethink Priorities is build a tool that helps us be more transparent about that process. That has involved taking this metaphor seriously, modeling ourselves and our organizations as moral parliaments, assigning a bunch of numbers. That itself is an interesting, important part of the process. It helps us see the impacts of different estimates. Then we can start putting in credences. When we do that, we do get very interesting results that can support the way funding is actually getting spent right now, or allocated rather, in EA. However, there's a strong degree of dependency on the specific method that you choose for navigating your uncertainty. And then the final observation is just that if you're really uncertain, if you're someone like me, then actually you don't need to worry that much about that uncertainty. You can just look across the spread of methods for navigating your uncertainty, and that itself can be instructive. It provides some structure to your ignorance. And what it points toward, I think, are consensus sorts of options. We're all kind of in a give well here, aren't we? Let's be honest. And give well looks really good on the method that we've developed. Thanks so much for your time.
It's really great. So there's a few questions coming in now, and I'll just read them out to Bob, and he'll share some of his thoughts on it. The first question here is from Simon Wu. Question is, any relation or inspirations of moral parliament model to internal family system model from psychotherapy?
No. That's a great question. And there probably are interesting ways that you could develop parallels there. What we were really doing was, the unspoken motto at Rethink Priorities is someone should have done that already, so I guess we will. And the idea of thinking about uncertainty as a moral parliament has just been around in the EA community for a long time. People have been talking about it for over a decade, but no one has tried to sort of see what would happen if you implemented, and so we were just sort of running with that central thought without sort of looking at all the other possible metaphors that you might use that would be productive.
Thank you. Next question here is from Jen Chen. Practically speaking, has using this moral parliament system changed your own personal donation strategy?
It's a good question. It has not yet. This is all new work. I do think it probably should. My own, like I said, I'm very much an animal person. I got into EA because of animal issues, and I'm probably willing to hang around EA insofar as it's willing to spend money on animal issues. That being said, I think it's harder for me personally to defend an exclusive focus on animals that I would like. And I have been much more inclined as a result of the work that I've been doing at Rethink Priorities over the last, I guess it's been almost 2 years now, this particular line of research that we've been doing, to be into diversification. So, my early perspective was just, let people do what they want, but I'm just going to push for animal stuff all the time. And now I think, no, what I really should push for is diversification, and probably something like the bulk on global health, although sort of a small majority, and then splitting things relatively evenly between animals and GCR related projects thereafter. That's the kind of view that I think it's easiest to defend based on the work that we've done over the last while.
Thank you. Next question here is from Amy Lee. Question is, Has your framework ever changed or augmented someone's intuitions?
The framework. You mean, are you asking about this tool specifically? Well, we've certainly, I mean, it's affected mine, as I just reported. It's had that impact. I think we only put this out 6 weeks ago or something. So reports back of people playing with it and having their views shifted are, still trickling in. Will be a little bit of time before we see what kind of impact we've had with this. And I think there's also the issue that we don't think the main takeaways are you ought to have this specific allocation. There's sort of these meta level things about the impacts of ways of navigating uncertainty and what happens if you have this overall disagreement about the right voting method or what have you. I've had a couple of chats with folks who have found the point about these methods the methods for allocating or aggregating your uncertainty to be quite striking, because they thought that they were going to get the same results sort of regardless of what they did. But we'll have to see how it changes over time.
All right. The next question is from Ethan Milne. Very interesting talk. I'm wondering if you've measured whether this moral parliament method results in 1, higher rates of conversion from intention to donate to actual donation, 2, higher retention among charities selected via this process, and or number 3, higher rates of satisfaction with this process, or perhaps higher rates among individuals with particular traits.
I love that you are thinking already about this kind of measurement. We are, as you might imagine, a long way from being able to do anything like that. I mean, so we don't have any longitudinal data based on this, and we're only just getting now some initial impressions of the kinds of parliaments that people are setting up and the kinds of ways of aggregating uncertainty that appear to be most popular based on usage data. So we're in the earliest stages of figuring out what people are doing with this tool and what their implications are, or what the implications might be in terms of practice. One of the things that we want to do at the end of the year or the beginning of next year is some user surveys and ask people a bit about this and try to see if we can get some sense of how these tools have had impact. I think this is in general a very difficult thing for the kind of research that we do at Rethink Priorities, where we're producing public goods for the EA community, but they're hard to track. And it's very difficult to know exactly how people are updating based on them. And often they're a small part of an overall narrative about someone's change, and then who knows how much credit you should really be taking. So it's very difficult to suss this out. That being said, it's obviously important, and I would love to see more conversations about tracking this. One of the things that has happened in the last several weeks is that we've been approached by a number of people who do donor advising, and they're interested in versions of these tools that could be useful for that purpose and help people who are trying to make allocations think more concretely about their own values and what that might imply. There are complexities there about how to do that in a way that's user accessible. I ran through a lot of complexity. You can easily imagine someone being overwhelmed by all the options that they have available to them. So it takes some doing, but this is the kind of thing that we might be able to achieve over time, and that might be useful.
Thank you. This one's from Will de la Guardia. Question is, should we think about a giving portfolio as reflecting our values, or thinking of our donations as rebalancing the global portfolio to be closer to our values?
Great question. So just so that everyone appreciates the significance of this, you could have a view where what we're trying to do is just figure out sort of in isolation what we ought to be doing, right? If I were just the only giver, how would I split the pot? Or you could be thinking, hey, look, just about everybody is spending their money on the opera and, children's reading programs. And so we should just focus on the most neglected stuff. And the most neglected stuff will be the high EV stuff. And maybe now we think that just means all the money goes to an X-RIS project and maybe the most numerous animals, right? So you could have that kind of view. There's a lot of things to say about this. It's very complicated. I think there are a couple of observations that I can make at a very high level that might be useful. One of them is that there just are different kinds of targets for this work. We always have large EA actors in mind when we are building our tools. And so one of the reasons why we think it's productive to flag what happens when you have different procedures for navigating uncertainty is that there are organizations that have collective decision-making bodies that actually have to implement a method for deciding how they are going to split the resources available to them, and this is useful for them. And so if you're giving away enough money and you actually have to vote, then you really want to see what happens if you choose different ways of voting, right? So that's one of the background motivations that we have in mind. Then there is this question about well, what should you do as an individual? I think here, there is always going to be a strong argument for going all in because the impact that you as an individual donor is going to have by spreading, right, is you're diminishing very likely whatever impact you're going to be able to have because there often are thresholds of impact where you need to raise certain amounts of money before various projects become unlocked, right? And so putting more money into particular things that you think are high EV is actually especially important because that is the way that those kinds of organizations can achieve the various things that they want to achieve. That being said, I don't know many people at all who follow this practice of going all in. And I think we need to recognize that there is something that we are responding to that is important about the way we think about our charitable activities overall. We're not EV maximizing robots. We are human beings who are somehow trying to make sense of our lives and feel okay about the way that we're navigating the world. And part of that involves somehow feeling like we are participating in ways that we can live with in our do-gooding efforts. And so I don't think we should diminish the role of that motivational aspect of giving, right? Giving is something that matters to us at a sort of existential level. Many of us have made this part of our identity because we think it is a significant thing to contribute to the projects that are attempting to improve the world. And so some degree of diversification, even as an individual giver, I think is a thing that we need to accommodate. And so though that does not answer the philosophical question about what has the highest EV, it does answer questions about the value of resources for navigating the challenge of diversifying.
I'm going to combine two questions here from Jen and Marcus, which is kind of similar. Where can we access this tool and how long does it take to fiddle with it to get useful results?
Sure. So there's a post about this on the forum. If you search Rethink Priorities, Moral Parliament, you'll get it. The URL is just something like parliament.rethinkpriorities.org. So it's easily available. A quick Google search, forum search will bring it up to you. In terms of the challenge of getting used to it, I think probably about 10 minutes of playing makes it pretty obvious what kinds of things are driving some of the main results. And then there's an interesting question of, well, what do you want to get out of it after that? So it took me quite a long time of messing around before it occurred to me to start thinking about, well, what happens in these very low credence situations and how sensitive are we to different kinds of results and blah, 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 blah. So, your mileage is going to vary based on the amount of time you're willing to spend and the kinds of answers you're trying to get out. But I think you can get a sense of the lay of the land in a relatively short period of time. You just start clicking through and you can quickly find some interesting results.
I'm going to take a couple more questions here. I'm just being mindful of time. It's 12:25. As I mentioned, there are office hours right after this at High Park, so we can continue on there. But the next one is from Diane Duran. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly. The difference in outcomes based on the decision-making method is striking. What implications do you think this work has on institutional decision-making?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. That's a great question. I think there are a lot of implications. I think, one of them is that, look, we're often not just uncertain about morality, but we're often uncertain about how we would go about resolving our disputes about moral matters. One of the interesting things is that, at least at a broader societal level, we're somewhat more comfortable thinking about things like, well, how should we vote? Right? We already have norms around those things. We're already pretty committed to some sort of broadly democratic point of view. We think there is some value in getting the wisdom of the people that we think are worth having in the room in the first place, et cetera. Those kinds of considerations are actually in many ways more familiar and more consensus producing. And so one of the things that I think is striking from an institutional decision-making perspective is that if you just implement just about any of the voting methods, rather than just doing something like maximizing expected choice worthiness, then you're just going to get more consensus and compromise-oriented results, which is to say, you're going to get more classical EA kinds of portfolios that are skewed toward global health and then provide additional resources for what are ultimately bigger gambles from a moral point of view, namely focusing on GCRs and animals. So that's I think the main upshot, just that there's a mechanism in place for focusing on a thing that we already sort of know how to navigate, and it itself is a pretty interesting way of spitting out outcomes that are very practically significant in the current season of EA.
All right, I think I'll wrap it up there just because of timing. As mentioned, we can continue this in High Park at 12:30. With that, can we give another round of applause to Bob, please?
Thank you very much.